Hello, it's so nice to see the three of you. I'm so glad we get to do this together today. My name is Elaine Chukan Brown. I'm Inupiaq, Unangan, and Sukpiaq from Alaska, and I am a writer and speaker about wine. Very happy to be here to help moderate today. We're all going to be introducing ourselves just briefly before we get started. And so, Viviane, I would love to ask for you to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Vivian Kennedy. I am a transgender woman and winemaker in Portland, Oregon. I use the winery's platform to do advocacy for and raise funds for organizations to provide direct support to queer and transgender folks.
Thank you. Cara, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I am Cara Patricia. I am the co-founder and advanced sommelier at Decant San Francisco, a retail bar and bottle shop. And I am kind of an outspoken feminist who really just wants to change the future of our industry so that nobody has to go through what I went through.
Thank you. Shanika, would you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shanika Hillocks. I am a proud Black woman working in marketing, spearheading the influencer marketing strategy at E&J Gallo. I am similar to Cara in the sense of looking forward to uplifting folks who look like me and encouraging more representation in the industry that I love, which is hospitality, wine, and food.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to open this conversation and do this with each of you. We are going to have an important conversation about the state of feminism in the wine industry and in general in the United States. And one of the key points that we want to really use to help frame this conversation is the idea of intersectionality. And in its most basic form, intersectionality is an idea that really originates from Black women thinkers in the United States as a point of making the point that no one social category is enough to explain our position in the world. That our various social categories, gender, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, all inform each other and how we are perceived in the world, how others interact with us, how we feel in the world and move through the world. We're going to discuss this further today. But it's a really important idea to consider in relation to the state of feminism in the United States and what we are doing when we have women-focused wine events as well, in that only focusing on gender is never enough to address social justice and social change. And so we want to bring this point of intersectionality to the fore. We can see how crucial it is to talk about this when we look at the history of social justice in the United States. It was actually Black women that instigated activism to give women the right to vote in the United States, starting in the 1800s. Later in the 1800s and early 1900s, white women stepped to the fore, taking up the same cause, and eventually winning their right to vote in the 1920s. Even though Black women had actually started the movement, they were excluded from the vote for another 5 decades. Native American women would not receive it for decades further still. Then later in the 1960s, the gay rights movement gets started by Black trans women, who are then unfortunately pushed to the side of the movement as well as white, gay and lesbian activists gain attention and prominence. More recently, we have seen Native Americans in Arizona and Black women in Georgia step to the fore to change the state of American politics just in the last few months. And so keeping these things in mind, we have to recognize that men and women of multiple races, multiple sexual orientations, various gender identities, abilities, and classes have all actually changed the face of American politics consistently through our history. And so as we step forward to advocate for each other more strongly, we must allow this point of intersectionality to become a stronger part of the conversation. For unfortunately, when we advocate only for women, it's easy for trans women and Black women to be pushed to the side in favor of a colorblind politics that ends up creating exclusion or a demand for Black, trans, Indigenous, and women of color to adjust to white norms. So the history of feminism in the United States has actually been a history of white cisgendered feminism. And by bringing intersectionality into the conversation, we can help change that dynamic and advocate for all groups together. So I would like to turn now to the panel to help develop these ideas. And Viviane, what I would really love to do is to start with you. You do amazing work out of Portland, advocating for the LGBTQIA community there, doing fundraising work through your winemaking as well. And in the midst of this advocacy work, you're consistently making the point that Black women and Black voices must be centered. Can you talk us through the importance of that idea?
Well, thanks, Elaine. Like you touched on, historically, the concept of feminism in the US has benefited directly from the work of Black and other women of color. And those benefits have largely translated into better conditions for the white women, essentially. If we're going to recenter and take a real look through an intersectional lens, we have to course correct and make sure that we are centering Black women and Black voices in advocating for, when we're talking about advocating for women, because like we touched on, that is transmutated into, largely in the course of our history as a country, that advocating has really benefited white cisgender women the most. And so we need to get back to advocating for the most marginalized women in the movement, and those who have actually done the most work for the least credit, essentially. And so moving forward, we really need to use that as the foundation of our feminism and advocacy for women.
Yeah, thank you. Shanika, you've really touched on this point as well by, I think some people are unaware of this broader idea of womanism rather than merely feminism. So could you talk us through that idea of womanism and the importance of that in this conversation?
Yes, thank you, Elaine. I really appreciate that you helped ground and center the conversation first and foremost by definitions. Intersectionality being the word, that really started the conversation off, and womanism actually takes that idea of intersectionality, and allows us to see the full facet of feminism, but how it relates then to Black women. That term was coined by a scholar, a lawyer, and a key opinion leader in this movement, Kimberly Crenshaw, and it really just centers, again, taking into account, not only does Black women believe in equality, but also they have to now layer their race into the conversation, into the mix, as well as their gender. So looking at all of the ways in which those points and characteristics then feed into our oppression, and then outwardly how that expresses itself in our advocacy for our rights.
Well, and one of the things that I recall in this conversation on womenism is that idea that feminism is one movement underneath the larger umbrella of womanism. Am I remembering that right?
Yes, it is correct. It's not to say, that we do not, we're discounting, so to speak, the rights of the women that are also part of this movement, but it allows us to then center the conversation, I think, even to your point historically, about the work, some of the, advancements that we have now been able to afford to our other counterparts, and not seeing that really be credited, or then seeing the benefits of those movements then come back to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Kara, when we've spoken, one of the things you've wanted to emphasize too is how listening plays such a key role in this kind of work, but also listening across generational differences. Could you speak about that as well?
Yeah, I think that our idea of feminism, womanism, is something that has changed dramatically over the past few decades, especially for women that have been working in this industry, whether it is food and beverage, wine, and experiences, I think, have changed. The way people react to experiences have changed, and it has created, I think, a small schism between the sort of younger generations of womanists and intersectional feminists who have kind of had enough, and the sort of generations previous that can sometimes make it seem like, well, this is kind of a part of the game that you play, and this is sort of how it is, or I didn't really have that experience, so I can't relate. And I don't, and I'm sorry that now I'm learning that you're having this, but I wasn't doing anything in the previous years to help make some change. And I think that listening to the younger people with patience, listening to people that don't look like you, that don't have the same background as you, empathizing, and believing, and trying to move forward to make our industry so much more inclusive is really, really key. So that's what I'm really focused on doing moving forward for myself.
Well, and that point about previous generations almost having to put up with some conditions that we now have the opportunity to change. You know, so even some of us with more experience actually can learn how to do more and do better by listening to people that are in a different situation now.
Exactly, because at some point you might now have a power that you didn't have 20 years ago when you started in this industry. So you can now pass on a better culture, hopefully, if you have the wherewithal to actually listen and believe, and not grow impatient with folks that are really fighting for change right now.
Right. It speaks very much, I think, Shanika, to a point that you made, that understanding takes time. Could you comment on that further as well?
Absolutely. I think particularly within the last year, we have really seen an uprising from several voices, just to Kara's point, have had enough. And I think in that proclamation, oftentimes there's this need to have this expedition of sorts and do things rather quickly in response to. And I believe that in that understanding, it's necessary to take pause and ask questions of yourself, even, in your own action. How have you potentially contributed to the way in which the system is operating? Being able to get different perspectives. I often find that, especially on social media, it can sound or seem like we're all saying the same thing, almost to the point where there's this echo chamber, and then you're just having similar ideas with the very folks that kind of look and have the similar beliefs as yourself. And so a huge part of understanding, I think, in my opinion, is to press pause and just sit with other stories, other perspectives, looking back at history to really assess what your action plan is and how that might be unique to you and your capabilities.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and Viviane, you like to make the point that our advocacy, in being advocates, that's a form of allyship as well, that we have to make sure we're not leaving, in promoting our own needs and rights, we're not leaving others behind as well. And I think it connects to that idea of getting outside the echo chamber that Shanika and Kara were just talking about too. Could you talk more about that? How do we when we're advocating for groups that we're familiar with, how do we ensure that we're also connecting to other groups and not inadvertently leaving their needs behind as well?
Yeah, so understanding the intersectionality of identities and making sure to connect with folks under the banner of the particular identity. Of course, I do a lot of advocacy for LGBTQIA folks, but that there's a wide spectrum of identities under that banner, and we have to make sure that we are recognizing and advocating for all the different identities of under the LGBTQIA umbrella, under womanhood in general, in order to really make change, advocating for groups beyond just our individual focus as how we can actually move things forward and make sure that the playing field is level and the opportunities are there for all women, not just women that are a part of the groups that we are focusing on advocacy for.
Right. Do you have thoughts on the ways that we can do that, ways we can kind of expand our thinking and awareness to include other groups as you're describing?
really important to make connection points and have conversations to foster a greater understanding, so that we're making sure, as we are including those groups in our advocacy, that we are aligning our advocacy with the needs and the progress that needs to be made for those identities.
It really strikes me like the conversation we're talking about. I feel like the idea of community building is so integral to what we're describing here, and that we have to be always remembering it's not only about me, it's not only about my needs, it's actually about building community so that my needs are met with the community, with others as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Kara, you've talked about that, a similar idea, I think, with just the notion of expanding your bubble. Could you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no excuse now, especially, I mean, look at us. We're all together here to talk about this from all different parts of the country. There is no excuse now to not be able to befriend and have conversations with people that are not just your local group or your local family or the people that you grew up with. There's just no excuse not to expand your bubble. We can do that every day. You can do that on Twitter, you can do that on Instagram, you can do that on Clubhouse, you can do that on Zoom calls. And that's the only way I think that you can start to step outside of yourself and your experiences and start to listen to other experiences. Because the big thing that we need to remember in the workplace, in your day-to-day, is your experience is not everybody's experience. And I think that's a big part of this. Sometimes we hear people say things like, oh, I don't want to get political. It's nice to have the luxury, the privilege to not get political when some people's mere existence is political, just the audacity of them wanting to be themselves or coming to work every day is political. So if the more that we listen, the more that we expand, the easier I think it will be for us to not only understand and believe everybody else, but to be willing to learn and make mistakes and correct yourself. And you almost have this new safe space with this new community to be able to grow and take that knowledge that you're learning and pass that along. And you have to educate yourself, obviously. You can't put all of that labor on these groups that you're not a part of. But having those conversations, even if it's just about wine, with a group of people who work in different markets than yours, that is so, so helpful to just becoming a better human, a better person in this business, a better advocate overall.
Do you have any simple examples of ways people can expand their bubbles, either online or in person?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of depends on what we're talking about, but one thing I've been really loving is, the world of Instagram right now. I think it's such a cool way to be able to meet whole groups of people, to be able to follow, like, the Hue Society is teaching me something that it's making me think, watching their stories about some things I haven't been thinking about or I haven't been vocal about myself. So maybe with Sipping Socialite, someone just posted this story about, intersectionality, thinking about migrant farmers. And thinking about that, something I always think about is, where does my feminism, my womanism lie within the supply chain of the business that I'm in, which is the world of wine? Am I making sure that the producers I work with are not exploiting labor? Because that is another part of this. And so if I can learn and I can do my homework, then maybe I can make a difference by communicating that to my guests about how these wines are not only sustainable, but they're feminist in a way, because we're not seeing exploitative labor of migrant women. We're not seeing exclusionary practices in the hiring at these wineries. And I think that's just this little way of kind of bringing it to light without being political, in a sense.
Right. So just kind of continuing to bring information to the fore.
Absolutely, absolutely. Everything you learn, pass it along, because some people just don't know. And it's not, they don't mean to be ignorant. They just don't know sometimes.
Well, and it connects to, Shanika, you commented earlier on how important it is to be aware of our definitions, but I know, you do a lot of work in communication, thinking about how we communicate. And, Cara was just talking about as we gather information, we can share that information, and that helps kind of spread the news, so to speak, but it all can change someone else's perspective on these issues as well, or make them think about something they haven't before. And so I was hoping you could just comment on that. When you and I spoke previously, you made the point that, how we use our terminology is so important, but how we live these ideas is even more important. So I was hoping you could comment on both those ideas, how we communicate, but also how we're living them.
Absolutely. I love that Cara helped center a little bit in the vein of industry. From my perspective, I work in marketing, and so the way in which words are packaged and presented is quite important, oftentimes to kind of ignite a response or conversion of a sale or some sort of engagement. And I think particularly with language and verbiage, intersectionality, almost to some degree felt like it was a trending topic per se. You saw it, spanned across several statements, even in some bios and on Twitter conversations. And I think it's one thing to ground yourself in a trend phrase, but then after you're looking up the Merriam-Webster dictionary, then how are you actually executing that in yourself? A point that also comes to mind is the understanding of the multiplicity of each of our experiences. I think it's often so easy to want to hop on the bandwagon for the sake of making noise, but taking into account where you are and meeting yourself there, I think is another important part of this. Whether you do have access to several groups on Instagram or on social media, I also think it's about being a little bit vulnerable to say, this is where I'm at and this is where I would like to be, versus joining a conversation and aiming to be active in that conversation, I think can be a little bit dangerous at times if you're not actually acknowledging kind of the place in which you are at and where what your agenda might be in these conversations.
I'm like hearing this kind of it's circling of ideas where, the importance of listening connects to the importance of educating yourself, and sharing those ideas. But now you're really emphasizing, as you try to step into conversation, it might not be about you speaking, right? It might actually be being present, but really in order to take in ideas. I think it goes back to your point that let yourself marinate. There's so much eagerness for people right now to make change, and please God, let's make change. Sure. And your point that it can also be dangerous. Like, we have to really be circumspect, increase our self-awareness, and think about how we're presenting ourselves, how we're speaking, how we're acting, how we're sharing.
For sure. One example that comes to mind is like, in small conversations, I've had folks akin a lot of this to like missionary work or disaster relief, where you're like going into a place and you're immediately kind of peppering out what you think that community needs, versus even just pressing pause and asking what they need, and then taking action from there. So I think that's a very small example, but something that a lot of us should keep in the forefront of our minds.
I think there's an idea that's been emerging over this last year about the difference between charity work and community building work. Charity work assumes I have an advantage that I'm going to give to this person that has less advantage. But notice there's a power differential there.
Yep.
And there's also an assumption of, I'll condescend to do something for you. Aren't I a nice person? I think we have to be really careful about how that shows up in very subtle ways in social change work and in the wine industry as well. And community building, by contrast, is saying, we're going to build something together. Let me hear what you need. How can I contribute and also meet my need? There's that advocacy again. And
precisely.
Viviane, you've talked about, again, you made this beautiful comment that advocacy is about making our place safer. and making advocacy in the wine industry is about making the wine industry safer. Can you talk more about that idea?
Yeah, I think that certainly historically, the industry, both from an internal side and the customer side, has catered to and created spaces that are comfortable spaces and meet the needs of cisgender white men primarily. And our advocacy for change in the industry has to focus on shifting the focus of the spaces and how those spaces meet the needs both of the folks in the industry and our customers that we're working with, and creating spaces that are not catered specifically to cisgender white men is going to make a huge difference in making spaces more accessible and allowing opportunities for folks to feel empowered and safe engaging in wine spaces. I've seen it with events, specifically doing events in the years over the wine industry, where again the demographic breakdown has been such that it clearly demonstrates that at the point at which I entered the wine industry, that it was a much safer space primarily for white people, and we have to think about what we can do to make those spaces open and welcoming to everyone.
Do you have examples of some basic things that we can keep in mind in that sense?
We'll get into it during the tips and takeaways too, but the concept of single-use gender neutral restrooms, for example, coming at it from the standpoint of a transgender woman who moving through space, certainly safe bathroom accessibility makes a big difference. Making sure that we are creating spaces where education and mutual conversation are welcomed versus ramming the information down folks' throats. It can certainly seem inaccessible if there's a barrier in terms of knowledge. So we need to make sure that we're working education and communication into it as well, as far as how we interact with our coworkers and our customers and how we present those things in a marketing sense too.
I know too that one of the things that we talked about previously was the idea that when we do public facing education around advocacy issues, that we think about who the speakers on those issues are as well. Could you talk about that a little bit?
We need to make sure that we are centering knowledgeable voices who are actually impacted, and making room for voices that haven't been featured or allowed at the table. We talked about just tying it back in, the commitment to allyship and advocacy. It really is it's a lifelong learning choice too, and we have to it's something that we have to undertake and understand that we're going to be continuously taking in and receiving new knowledge and learning on a continuous basis.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and so, yeah, I mean, I think another way to put what I'm hearing you say too is, if we're going to have social justice education on a specific social justice issue, then we need to have educators who are actually living,
who have lived experience
yeah,
with those issues, rather than having it presented from someone who does not have lived experience in that situation or a personal understanding of that identity.
Right, because again, this is one of the key aspects of understanding intersectionality, that we don't all have the same lived experience. And so if I want to learn how to be a better advocate for someone with a different lived experience than I have, I need to learn from people with that insight. Yeah. So this, something that keeps coming up in this conversation too, is just that idea that we have to keep learning, that this is a lifelong process. There are things that we're going to be confronted by at moments. Times we're going to make mistakes. And, Cara, you brought this up in your comments a moment ago. And so I was hoping, I think it's important we give each other a bit of advice on how do we deal with that, right? Some people have a really hard time being corrected, or quickly go into, oh my God, I failed, I let everybody down, when actually it's like, no, could be a simple change, just shift this, So do you have advice on how you would suggest people handle those moments when we need to be corrected?
I think patience and kindness is always going to work the best. It's sort of this idea of what correcting someone, educating someone cannot. Oh, people get so defensive when they make mistakes. People hate making mistakes. They hate being embarrassed. They hate being wrong. I just absolutely understand that, but we have to correct people. It's this idea of like, if you see something, say something. If somebody is making an off-color joke, they're using the wrong words, they're misgendering someone, there is a way to take a second, give them a little correction, and like keep going in the conversation. Now, I'm talking about people who are misspeaking, not people who are being horrible. People who are being horrible or think they're making funny jokes, sometimes I'll do something like, I don't get it. Can you explain it to me? Like, what's funny about that? And that sort of makes them take a second to realize like, oh, first of all, probably shouldn't say these things at all. More than, oh, Cara, you are just, you're so snobby, you're so PC, you're so whatever. Instead, it's kind of like they have to rethink what they said and realize that maybe it wasn't exactly appropriate, and they probably should change their way of thinking in general by what they say, how they say, and where they do it. We can't, not everybody means to be horrible, but when they are, we have to change. And then if we are called out, we really need to take a second and think about it, apologize, move forward, ask what is a better way, if we don't know, of how to express ourselves. Because what you don't want is the friction that ends up happening with throwing up their hands, being like, PC culture. I don't want to have to remember somebody's pronouns. I don't want to have to worry about bathrooms. I don't want to hire this person just because I'm afraid I'm going to offend them because they're not going to get my joke. And that's something that women have been dealing with moving up in their careers forever. And I can't imagine what it must be like to also be Black, also be transgendered woman or man, also be Indigenous, anything like that. That's like, people get so afraid of offending that they kind of want nothing to do with it at all.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember we don't have to imagine what someone else is going through. We get to listen, we get to learn,
Exactly.
we get to practice respect.
Exactly.
And that's what it's about. That it's not about us thinking we're supposed to already know where they're at, because our experiences are all different, as we've been talking about.
And I think that's a part of what Viviane was saying with advocacy, right? You correcting or helping make some change is advocating for folks, even if they're not a part of your immediate circle. It's advocating for folks across the board.
Yeah. So we're almost out of time, so I want to make sure we get a few more comments into it. Shanika, do you have some more recommendations just about, because again, you've been talking about we need to have that patience, we need to recognize it takes time, so do you have any just brief comments on tips people can have, like, to keep in mind? How do I address being corrected? How do I stay open to learning?
Absolutely. I think piggyback, I just wanted to also take into account sometimes, although kindness and compassion, I think are key points in human being. I want to be careful also too with having kindness almost be a band-aid of sorts. Sometimes there is such a thing as like niceness politics. And I also want to acknowledge that at the forefront, because oftentimes I think that kindness can make the topic at hand seem rather small, or the urgency then is kind of dialed back a bit. And it's interesting because as I'm discussing, it almost seems like I have two opposing points here, like take your time, but also stand your ground in that urgency and be firm in yourself, but I think there's the pendulum swings, right? And so to find like a nice medium, I think that is something in which is necessary. I also feel like the admittance of the role in which you play is super important. It's not to say that you need to rest all of your like laurels on that, one occurrence that happened in the past, but it is an opportunity, I think, to take into account an adjustment that could be made in the future, or an example even that you can share in vulnerability. I think one of the biggest things that I found in conversing with women from across age, socioeconomic background, different genders and races is when I am able to come to the forefront and say, hey, this was an experience that I actually made a misstep. It allows and invites other folks to showcase that vulnerability and I think find a more common ground, as you stated, with more community work versus the charity work.
Yeah, I think one way I think about that difference too is that kindness comes from a compassion. Niceness is about following social norms. So niceness maintains the status quo. We can be kind to each other by caring and recognizing we have different experiences and come from different places.
Mm-hmm.
But that actually also demands that we recognize the impact we have and that our intention is not enough. This is not about shrinking ourselves or changing ourselves. It's about recognizing we're in community and we must recognize the impact we have and have compassion for each other without having to maintain the status quo. And Vivian, I'd like to ask too, do you have any brief comments just on kind of advice? How can we stay open to keep learning and make those corrections as well?
I think that, choosing not to be defensive when we make a mistake and when we are corrected, embracing that as an opportunity, those instances as an opportunity to learn and understanding that we are, in whatever we are doing, we are always going to make mistakes. It's a continuous learning process. And so we need to be open to feedback and understanding that we all have opportunities for growth. So embracing that as an opportunity for growth versus centering how we feel for being called out in those situations.
Yeah, that's so important. I think, we hear a lot about white fragility and white tears. And the point of talking about that kind of thing is that those conversations centers somebody's feelings. The point of social justice work is to acknowledge our feelings, recognize what they're trying to tell us, and center our care for each other and our action for change instead. Our feelings exist, we value them, we care about them. The point is to center our care for each other and our action for change. And so we have just a couple minutes left. I'd love to hear one or two tips from each of you, very simple things we can do to advocate. Vivian, earlier you mentioned trying to ensure that there are gender neutral single stall bathrooms in our event spaces. That's a great example of a tip for people to keep in mind. Vivian, do you have another tip or two that you'd like to suggest?
The bathrooms one was a big one. The other one that we had talked about was just making sure that in workplace diversity and equity training that trans voices are included in that, and that there is a focus on that as part of those trainings. It'll go a long way towards making the spaces safer for trans and queer folks. So
yeah, great, thank you. Cara, do you have a tip or two?
Yeah, and I'm gonna put this really on the wine industry as a whole, especially folks who are working in restaurants, retail spaces. Advocate with your selections. At my shop, Decant SF, we actively seek out wines made by women, queer communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And we do not do this to tokenize the groups. We're not like checking off a box like, well, we got an Asian made wine now, we don't have to worry about this anymore. We do this because we have buying power and we have the power to make space on our shelves for new voices, new winemakers, new artists. And that just helps us learn more about wine. It helps us be better sommeliers, and it helps our clients be able to continue to explore what they love so much. We want our wines to represent our clients. We do blind taste everything so that, the proof has to be in the juice. But another thing I would also say, another tip obviously do that. But for your social media and your e-commerce, is something that I'm working very, very much on right now, is how to make it more accessible to people that are vision or hearing impaired, how to work more on ADA access on your virtual space as well in your wine business.
Yeah, thank you. It's something that I really need to work on. I need to, include captions that describe the images that I have in my Instagram and on my websites. It's a simple thing that we can start to do moving forward. And that's something I need to make the commitment to do. And so I commit to adding that into my work, because that's a way to make social media and online content accessible across ability as well. So Shanika, I'd love to close with you and hear any tips that you would like to recommend.
I have two. I think first and foremost, we have been talking a lot about opening up our aperture a bit in terms of conversations and who we speak with. But I think first asking those individuals if they have the space and bandwidth to take on an emotional conversation, I think at the very upfront is something that's very key. Laddering back to the multiplicity of our experiences, the way that I'm surviving or thriving right now is going to be very different than yours. And so I think opening up any type of dialogue with that question is key. I also think about access, and it doesn't always have to be in the form of capital and money, although I do think that is a grand opportunity to allow for folks of all types of representation to then actuate their very clear ideas or agendas in the benefit of our group. But to bring someone into a specific space, if it is a wine tasting and someone has expressed the desire to expand their palate or tasting experiences, bring someone along. And if you're constantly being asked to be a speaker, I know that can often happen. To your point, Cara, about tokenization, sometimes in the industry, you start seeing the same, few folks on panels and things of that nature. So being able to politely decline opportunities, but then also recommend someone who could sit in that space, I think is such a small way. As we continue to live virtually, I'm sure and anticipate that we'll see more of these types of conversations, whether in the wine space or another industry. So that's another small, I think, adjustment and tip that I would offer.
That's great. I love that point too. And another way, depending on what the event is, that same idea can be done that I have seen work, is to say, oh, I will be happy to be a speaker as long as I can speak with and include someone else. And it's a way of kind of guaranteeing who gets brought in as speaker. And if they're motivated to invite you, you can use that motivation to bring in someone else and then shift the conversation to that person even while you're still present. So it kind of can depend on what the need is in the event. But yeah, so thank you. Thank you.
Small, but that is real advocacy right there too. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm so grateful to the three of you. It's been wonderful just having time with each of you to prepare for this panel as well. And I'm so glad to have the opportunity to be part of bringing the four of us together. And so thank you so much to Lift Collective and to all of the incredible hard work that has been put into making this event what it is, and to allowing us to have this conversation on intersectionality. Thank you.